Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thank you so much for joining us here on CBS News. We continue to follow some late-breaking news. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announcing today that he is no longer running for president. In a video posted on X, DeSantis endorsed former President Trump, previously his chief rival, for the White House. DeSantis' announcement comes after he came in second in the Iowa caucuses, but still substantially behind the frontrunner. Now, with his campaign over, Nikki Haley remains Trump's only competition in the race for the Republican nomination.
Now, following our second-place finish in Iowa, we've prayed and deliberated on the way forward. If there was anything I could do to produce a favorable outcome, more campaign stops, more interviews, I would do it. But I can't ask our supporters to volunteer their time and donate their resources if we don't have a clear path to victory. Accordingly, I am today suspending my campaign. I'm proud to have delivered on 100% of my promises, and I will not stop now. It's clear to me that a majority of Republican primary voters want to give Donald Trump another chance. They watch his presidency get stymied by relentless resistance, and they see Democrats using lawfare this day to attack him. Well, I've had disagreements with Donald Trump, such as on the coronavirus pandemic and his elevation of Anthony Fauci. Trump is superior to the current incumbent, Joe Biden. That is clear. I signed a pledge to support the Republican nominee, and I will honor that pledge.
We have team coverage in New Hampshire. We want to bring in now CBS News political director Finn Gomez. Finn, just 2 days before the very first primary that's set to take place here in the United States, one of the major candidates drops out. How much of a surprise is this, and how much does this shake up everything leading to the New Hampshire primary?
I think if you spoke to some of his rival campaigns, there would not this news that happened today of Ron DeSantis dropping out of the race would not be met with a lot of surprise. After Iowa and after that 30-point loss, even though he came in second to Donald Trump, there was really no discernible path outside of Iowa. Where would he go? Where is his path? And does he have the amount of money to fuel a campaign through New Hampshire to South Carolina and to those Super Tuesday states that happen in early March? So therefore, not really a lot of surprise, maybe in the timing. But I spoke to someone close to the DeSantis campaign who tells CBS News that Ron DeSantis would rather drop out now as the second place finisher in Iowa than go through the New Hampshire primary and finish in a potentially a distant third. Therefore, the timing and looking ahead to 2028 and looking ahead to his political trajectory, Lana, he also would have to endorse someone who he believes will be the likely nominee, and that's Donald Trump, the frontrunner in this race and in New Hampshire right now.
And what did you make of that endorsement, Finn? Because when I was speaking with Aaron just a little bit ago, I was contrasting it with the Tim Scott endorsement that was so enthusiastic. And when we heard DeSantis saying, in essence, I signed a pledge, I'm going to stick with that pledge, I'll support him, you still don't like Nikki Haley, is what kind of boils down the boiled down message from what he posted on Twitter. Were you at all surprised by that endorsement or the tenor of it?
Well, you know, I think that's a great point, Lana, because if you compare that Tim Scott endorsement where he came to New Hampshire, he gave this ringing, enthusiastic endorsement of Donald Trump, and you compare that to that split screen, if you will, of today, where Ron DeSantis, as you said, looked a little tepid in his enthusiasm for his support for Donald Trump and almost felt obligated because he signed that pledge. So there's a long history that goes back there. If you recall, Lana, right after the November midterms when Ron DeSantis was won by 19 points in Florida in his gubernatorial re-election race, and it was seen as like the heir apparent of that MAGA mantle, if you will,
right,
to take that torch and continue with what Donald Trump had started. And he was even beating Trump in most polls then, or some polls polls then. And if you compare that to what happened now, I mean, it's really been such an interesting trajectory. And really, when I was talking to some people close to the Trump campaign, they say that it was really because they feel there's this tactic they used. If you recall, Lana, when he after those midterms, the results that happened back in November 2022, Ron DeSantis sort of sat on that lead and just took incoming for months from Donald Trump. He was called all these names: Ron DeSanctimonious, Ron DeSantis. Still not quite sure what that one means, but he was just like attacked. And he did not, Ron DeSantis, not really do much in response to those attacks for months. He wanted to go through his legislative session in Tallahassee, and then he announced. And so by doing that by waiting, it really just opened up that vulnerability, to Donald Trump, and allowed for Donald Trump to really increase in the polls, get some momentum. And as you see now, Trump, where he stands now, if you look at those the polls that we've been seeing, is still the pretty much the dominant front runner, even though it's a little bit closer of a race here in the Granite State.
So, Finn, I want to seize on something that you were saying about DeSantis seeing himself as the MAGA heir apparent, because he certainly came into this race feeling like he had those voters, and as we heard from Aaron, most of his supporters identified with that movement. And so it seems like a logical progression that they're now going to move over to Trump. But, you know, in speaking with Nydia, the Haley campaign today is celebrating. With all of your experience out on the campaign trail, which way do you think it'll break?
Well, you know, if you look at the latest polls, there's a new CNN poll that came out today that shows both Haley and Trump moving up a little bit, but there's still a double-digit difference between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in the lead. However, if you speak to her campaign, I did speak to her campaign manager just yesterday, who said, and today actually, and she told me that they feel really strong here. They've been appealing to independents. They've been really working their ground game operation. They have the support of the popular Republican governor, Chris Sununu, who's also part of this big major political dynasty here in the Granite State. His dad was the governor, his brother the former senator. So, you know, they have this structure here that she did not have in Iowa. And this is really the most competitive they feel that they can be at this point with Donald Trump. There was an earlier poll about a couple weeks ago that you saw her within striking distance of Donald Trump, about 7 points away. So they feel that they're closer. They feel that the independents will break for them, and the independents have a tradition of breaking late here in New Hampshire. So they feel that they could make it a real race come Tuesday. They also say pretty emphatically, Lana, that they are looking past Tuesday. They're looking to South Carolina, where she has they just purchased a $4 million ad buy that's going to run statewide starting Tuesday. They have an event on Wednesday in Charleston, a political rally, and they say they really have the money that Ron DeSantis, by the way, did not have. They have the financial support of that Koch brothers operation, Americans for Prosperity Action, that super PAC that has been doing a lot of the grassroots operation here as well. And they feel that they have the fuel to drive them through the cycle and take them to Super Tuesday. So regardless of the outcome on Tuesday, even if she comes in second, they feel that they have the ability to really progress forward.
Finn, if you can stay with us, I want to come back to you for some final thoughts, especially looking beyond Tuesday, looking at the general election and looking at the potential for one of these candidates to be back in the headlines for 2028. But I want to bring in now campaign reporter Olivia Rinaldi. She has been embedded with the Trump campaign and has been following him. How is the Trump campaign responding to this news, Olivia?
Yeah, hi, Lana. We found out about this news right before this Trump rally that's going to take place later tonight. We're up here in Rochester, New Hampshire. The news came down as people were waiting in line. You can hear cheers from where I was standing. People just extremely excited to hear that Trump's #1 foe in this race, which had been Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for a very long time, is now out of the race. And they were even happier to hear that his endorsement came immediately to the former president. That part was key to them. A lot of concern that I've been hearing from DeSantis allies allies and Trump allies is whether his endorsement, whether he'll pull out of the race and not choose to endorse someone, whether he will endorse someone. But to hear that it went directly to former President Donald Trump tells me that there's some wish for Ron DeSantis' political career in the future to continue on this journey. If Trump were to win the presidency, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis would still be governor during that first term for Trump. So really what that says to me is that he's still concerned about managing that relationship, having that there. And I spoke with a Trump advisor just a short while ago. He said that they're working through the news of how to handle it. He said Trump is surely going to address it tonight, and that just made this rally here a lot more interesting. Lana.
Absolutely, making this otherwise sleepy Sunday very wide awake. Olivia, now that it is down to a two-person race between Trump and Haley for the Republican nomination, one of the things that we were discussing earlier with other campaign embeds was that Haley's been making this case that whether it is Trump or whether it is Biden, that the country needs somebody younger, and she made some very specific allegations that Trump's mind isn't quite what it used to be. I'm going to play that sound for our voters, and then I want to get your thoughts.
He claimed that Joe Biden was going to get us into World War II. I'm assuming he meant World War III. He said that he ran against President Obama. He never ran against President Obama. He says that I'm the one that kept security from the Capitol on January 6th. I was nowhere near the Capitol on January 6th. But, Margaret, you don't be surprised if you have someone that's 80 in office.
So that was Haley on Face the Nation speaking with our Margaret Brennan earlier. Olivia, we've heard her make similar arguments before, but I thought that this was one of the most forceful times we've heard her attacking the former president. How are they responding?
Yeah, Donald Trump took those remarks head on last night. Rarely does he ever respond to direct criticism, especially from Nikki Haley. But last night, he said that he took a cognitive exam and his doctor said he's doing well and that he aced it. He also said that he's not 80, he's 77, and there's nothing wrong with being 80. It's those ageism attacks that he's really tried to fend off, those comparisons that he perhaps has some issues with memory, comparisons that we've heard for President Joe Biden as well. So Donald Trump took those head on last night and said there's no problem with my memory. And if there was, he told his supporters, I'd make sure to tell you.
All right. Olivia, you can go ahead and stay with us for another minute. I want to go back to Finn Gomez. Finn, when we're talking about 2024 and we're looking at that matchup, we hear a lot from the Haley campaign that they are outperforming the former president in a matchup against Joe Biden. How do you see the greater state of play for that general election there from the voters that you're talking to now?
I think, and speaking of voters, both in Iowa and here, they are still focused on these early state matchups, these early nominating states. Obviously, this is the first in the nation primary. There's a lot of focus and a lot of attention. But, there are those that I've spoken to who really see the general election matchup as one between a rematch of 2020 between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. And, if you talk to Democrats which I've spoken to, some senior Democrats who are also focusing on that rematch. There's, just last week in Iowa when the Biden-Harris campaign came to Des Moines, right before caucuses, their focus wasn't on any of the other Republicans vying to be the nominee in the primary. Their focus was on one person, and that was Donald Trump. And so if you speak, within both parties, Lana, there is really this sort of expectation that there's going to be this rematch. Even some of the third-party components that we've been talking to, No Labels, who can potentially run, RFK Jr., they're all gearing up for what they believe is a rematch, right? But you talk to the Nikki Haley folks, you talk to those seniors on the Nikki Haley campaign, and they say, hey, wait a second. We still got a big matchup here in the Granite State. We still got money. We still got a strategy that will get us through Super Tuesday. And some of those other states are more moderate. Some of those other states are not as perhaps socially conservative as these early states. South Carolina, her home state is, but you look at those 40-plus states on Super Tuesday, and there's a lot of ground there that they feel that they can compete. And again, financially, it's not a question there. They have the fuel. They believe they have the financial support to really drive them forward. But again, speaking to Republicans, speaking to Democrats, both at the grassroots level and in the upper echelons of both party structures, their focus really is on a Biden versus Trump rematch.
And I promised our viewers that I was going to ask you also about 2028, because if Trump does in fact win the White House, and that's it for him. If he doesn't, both DeSantis and Nikki Haley may be making another play for the top of the ticket. And we have reporting from Robert Costa that says that part of his decision-making in choosing to endorse Trump may have been looking at 2028 and seeing Haley as competition. What's going on with the Republican Party at the moment? Because we see this split in Congress. We see a split among Republican voters. As we're looking both forward to the general election into 2028, what's the sense of the Republican separation between the MAGA and non-MAGA movements?
Well, that's a great question, Lana. But right now, if you look at some of the recent polling about that, especially even within our own polling, that MAGA contingent is pretty strong, pretty fervent, and they vote, right? There was, in our own poll that came out just a little while ago, about a week ago, it showed that the comments made by former President Donald Trump saying that this controversial comment saying that immigrants poison the blood of the country, about 80% believed in those comments. They agreed with him. So that really stems from both the MAGA-ism that runs deep, those Trumplicans who believe more in him, who believe more in the MAGA principles than in the traditional establishment, free market, small government, Republican principles. There really is that divide that still exists, but right now, the momentum, those in control of the party are really from that wing, that MAGA wing of the party. However, looking ahead to 2028, and you're absolutely right. Robert Costa has great reporting on the DeSantis deciding in part to bow out now so you could save political face. I did again speak to someone close to him, close to Ron DeSantis, who said, look, he bows out now. He is the second place finisher in Iowa, right? He stays. He becomes the third place loser in New Hampshire, but still he can retain some of that, bragging rights, if you will, as you look ahead to 2028. Because either if it is a rematch, and if it is either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they're only there for one term. So immediately, the people in both parties are vying for that 2028 cycle. And they are both stacked. Both parties have these emerging leaders, both from at the state level and on Capitol Hill. They have governors. They have up and comers who are vying to be the next generational leader. And you really looking ahead. And we got a lot to go here in 2024, a lot before we get to 2028. There's a lot. We got about nine plus months before anything. There's a lot. We got a roller coaster in front of us.
We sure do.
Looking ahead to 2028. No, and if I get that crystal ball out, what you're looking at is that you're probably looking at a full on, everyone's in and running, you're going to have a very, very wide field, is my expectation, looking ahead to 2028.
Well, certainly with Ron DeSantis choosing to bow out now, there is some new momentum in both the Trump and the Haley campaign. But then there's also that question, especially for him and his supporters, about what will be next for him. So, Olivia, I'm just going to end with one last thought for you. Given that he did ultimately endorse Trump, but there were some very harsh words that were said along the way. Does it look like the Trump campaign and the former president will welcome him back in with open arms?
Yeah, Lana, I asked them whether or not this endorsement is well received, and they said well received, but also expected and accepted as well. They had been expecting this for a long time with them. So along with the lines of how the Trump campaign will receive it, I believe they'll take it in. But what I'm watching is if Trump's MAGA base will take DeSantis back in. There were a lot of words thrown around. In the last couple of days, we've seen some prominent voices in the MAGA movement saying, DeSantis, it's time to drop out and coalesce around Trump. And this is a very loyal base. So I could see a world where Trump says DeSantis is back in, we accept him, and his people accept it as well. That is something that I will be watching closely.
All right. A major development today. Appreciate you both for joining us. Finn Gomez and Olivia Rinaldi, thank you. Well, we will continue monitoring all that's happening out of New Hampshire and in the elections more generally. That does it for now. Face the Nation is next. I'm Lana Zach. Thanks for watching.